3 weeks passed before Xiaonu finally completed his communication array, working with materials that Jian had gathered from safer parts of the forest. The device hummed with power as he activated it for the first time, and his heart raced with a mixture of hope and unexpected sadness. Soon his people would come for him, and soon he would leave this strange world behind. He transmitted his distress signal and his coordinates, then settled back to wait for a response. Jian sat beside him, watching the tiny device with curiosity, even though she could not understand its purpose. He had tried to explain, through drawings and gestures, showing her pictures of ships descending from the sky to carry him home. Her smile had wavered when she understood, but she had nodded and helped him complete his work without complaint. The response came faster than Xiaonu had expected, crackling through his receiver with familiar Velis speech patterns. A rescue ship had been dispatched and would arrive within 1 planetary rotation. His commander's voice carried stern warnings about maintaining distance from the primitive giants until extraction. Xiaonu listened to the orders without responding, his eyes fixed on Jian as she prepared a meal for them both. She had nearly finished healing from the confrontation in the forest, though faint scars remained on her face. Those scars reminded Xiaonu every day of what she had risked and what he had learned about courage. He could not simply leave her without trying to change his people's understanding of beings like her. The ship descended through the clouds the following morning, its sleek Velith design looking impossibly small compared to the trees that surrounded the clearing. Jian watched with wide eyes as the vessel landed, her body tense but her position steady beside Xiaonu. She did not run or hide from this strange arrival. Trusting that he would protect her as she had protected him, the hatch opened and Velith commanders emerged, their wings catching the light as they approached with weapons drawn. Xian stood between them and Jian, his small form seeming even smaller against the backdrop of the giantess behind him. His commander stopped short when he saw the arrangement, horror spreading across his features. The translator crackled to life with urgent demands that Xiaonu step away from the dangerous creature immediately, but Xiaonu did not move. And when he spoke, his voice carried calm certainty that surprised even himself. He told them everything that had happened since his crash, starting with the terror he had felt and ending with the family he had found. He described Jiai's patience during those first days, her vigil through the storm, her gentleness as she healed his wing. He spoke of the bird she had nursed back to health and released without expectation of reward. He explained how she had confronted her own kind to protect a forest full of creatures smaller than herself, and he described how he, a tiny Velith who should have been helpless, had protected her in return. The commanders listened with growing disbelief, their weapons slowly lowering as Xiaonu's words painted a picture that contradicted everything they thought they knew. When he finished speaking, silence hung in the clearing like morning mist. Then Jian moved, and every Velith tensed with renewed alarm. She lowered herself to the ground and extended her open palm toward the commanders, her face holding that gentle smile that Xiaonu had learned to treasure. She spoke in her own language, words the Velith could not understand, but whose meaning transcended the barrier between species. She was offering welcome, and she was offering help. The commander looked at Xiaonu with uncertain eyes, clearly struggling with protocols and prejudices and the evidence. Before him, Xiaonu climbed onto Jian's extended hand and stood there with his wings spread wide, demonstrating trust in the most direct way possible. If the giantess wanted to harm them, she could have done so 1,000 times. And if she was the monster their stories described, she would never have saved his life. The commander's wings drooped with what might have been surrender or might have been the beginning of understanding. He ordered his crew to lower their weapons entirely, and he approached Jian with cautious steps. Words passed between him and Xiaonu, Questions about the planet and its inhabitants and the possibility of future contact. Ciano translated as best he could, and Gian responded with gestures and expressions that conveyed more than language ever could. By the time the sun began to set, arrangements had been made for formal diplomatic contact. Ciano would return to his homeworld to advocate for peaceful relations with this species called humans. He would share his story with councils and committees and anyone who would listen, and he would carry with him proof that size meant nothing when it came to the capacity for compassion. Gian seemed to understand that he was leaving, and tears gathered in her enormous eyes. She held him one last time, cupping him gently against her cheek while he pressed his tiny palms against her skin. He spoke the words she had taught him, the ones that meant the most in any language: thank you and friend and family. She replied with sounds he would remember for the rest of his long Velith life. Then she lowered him to the ground and reached into her pocket, producing a small carved figure that she pressed into his hands. It was a bird with outstretched wings, created from wood that still smelled of the forest. She protected. Ciano understood the gift and what it represented. Freedom given rather than taken, and he held it against his chest. He wanted to give her something in return, something that would remind her of the small creature she had saved, so he did the only thing he could think of doing. He reached up and carefully pulled one of the bioluminescent scales from his arm. Wincing at the pain but smiling through it, the scale would glow whenever Velith ships passed through this sector of space, a signal that her small friend remembered. Gian accepted the gift with trembling fingers and pressed it against her heart. The ship lifted off as darkness fell, carrying Sana toward the stars and the difficult work of changing minds. He pressed his face against the viewport and watched the blue planet shrink behind him, searching for the clearing where Gian still stood. He could not see her from this distance, but he knew she was there, watching his departure as she had once watched a healed bird fly away months later. When formal contact was finally established and Velith ambassadors descended to meet humanity for the first time, Ciano returned to the forest. Clearing, Gian was waiting with the scale clutched in her hand, its glow reflecting in her tear-filled eyes. She had seen the ships passing overhead, and she had known that her small friend had kept his promise. Ciano landed on her shoulder and pressed himself against her neck, and neither of them needed words for what passed between them. The Giantess had never wanted to eat him, and he had never needed to fear her. What she had wanted, what she had given him without expectation of return, was something far more precious than hunger. She had given him proof that love needed no common language and that family knew no boundaries of size. And as the Velith and humans began their long journey toward alliance, Ciano knew that it had all started here. It had started with a crash and a scream and a giant who chose gentleness. It had started with her. The forest looked different from Giant's shoulder than it had from the ground near his crashed ship. Ciano clung to the fabric of her jacket as she walked, marveling at how the world transformed when viewed from such height. Trees that had towered over him now passed at eye level, and creatures that would have seemed enormous before looked small and harmless from this vantage point. He understood now why giants might not feel threatened by smaller beings, and he wondered if this perspective shaped how Gian saw him. She moved carefully through the undergrowth, always aware of his presence and always adjusting her steps to avoid jostling him too roughly. The minerals he needed grew in caves near a rocky outcropping that Gian had visited many times before. She described these caves through gestures and the handful of words they had developed together, painting pictures of glittering walls and cool darkness. Ciano felt genuine excitement building in his chest as they traveled, because each step brought him closer to contacting his people. But something changed as they approached their destination. Gian stopped walking and tilted her head, listening to sounds that Ciano could not hear with his smaller ears. her expression shifted from peaceful to troubled. And she began moving faster through the forest with less care for stealth. They emerged from the trees onto a hillside overlooking a valley. And Xiaonu gasped at what he saw below. Massive machines tore through the forest floor, ripping up trees and piling them into great mounds of destruction. Giants operated these machines. Giants who looked similar to Jian, but whose actions spoke of very different intentions. They were destroying the forest. And they were doing it with terrible efficiency. Jian made a sound of distress that needed no translation. And Xiaonu felt her body tense with anger beneath him. She spoke rapidly in her language, her voice rising with emotion as she watched the devastation unfold. Then she began walking down the hill toward the machines. And Xiaonu realized with growing alarm that she intended to confront these destructive giants alone. He pulled at her collar and made sounds of warning. But she shook her head and kept walking. The giants noticed her approach when she was still some distance away, and several of them moved to block her path. They were larger than Jian, their bodies thick with muscle and their faces hard with unfriendly expressions. Words passed between them that Xiaonu could not understand. But the tone made the conflict clear enough. Jian wanted them to stop, and they had no intention of doing so. One of the giants stepped forward and shoved Jian backward, and Xiaonu had to grip her collar tightly to avoid falling. She stumbled but did not retreat, instead raising her voice louder and pointing toward the machines that continued their work of destruction. More words followed, and more pushing, and Xiaonu watched helplessly as the confrontation escalated toward violence. He had thought all giants were like Jian, gentle despite their size and protective despite their power. But these giants proved that assumption wrong with every aggressive movement and threatening sound. They surrounded her with predatory intent, and Xiaonu felt terror returning to his small body. This time the terror was not for himself but for the giantess who had saved his life. One of the giants raised his hand and struck Jian across the face, and she fell to the ground with Xiaonu still clinging to her clothing. He tumbled free when she hit the dirt, rolling across the forest floor until he came to rest against a fallen branch. Pain shot through his recently healed wing, but he ignored it as he watched the giants close in around Jian. They laughed as she tried to rise, pushing her back down each time she struggled to her feet. Something inside Xiaonu broke at the sight of his protector being treated this way. He had spent weeks hiding from giants and fearing their power. But now he saw Jian helpless before her own kind. She had risked everything to protect this forest and the creatures within it, and these monsters were hurting her for that protection. Xiaonu did not think about the danger or calculate the odds of survival. He simply acted on instinct deeper than fear. The Volith had one natural defense, a biological response meant to startle predators long enough for escape. Xiaonu had never used it before, but desperation pulled it from somewhere primal in his small body. His bioluminescent skin blazed with sudden brilliance, shifting from soft blue to blinding white in an instant. Light poured from every part of him like a tiny star had ignited in the midst of the giants. The attackers stumbled backward with cries of shock. Covering their eyes against the unexpected glare, Xiaonu maintained the light as long as he could, his body burning with the effort as he screamed at Jian to run. She scrambled to her feet and scooped him into her hand without hesitation, then turned and fled into the trees. The giants behind them shouted in confusion. Still blinded and unable to pursue, Jian ran until the sounds of machines faded into the distance and the forest swallowed them in its protective embrace. Only then did she stop, leaning against a tree and gasping for breath, while blood dripped from a cut on her face. Xiaonu's light had faded to a dim, exhausted glow, and his body ached from the strain of his display. But he climbed up Ji-Yun's arm and perched on her shoulder, examining her wound with desperate concern. The cut was deep, and the bruises spreading across her skin looked painful. But she was alive. She was alive because he had done something instead of hiding. And the realization brought tears to his glowing eyes. Jian spoke softly, her voice shaking with the aftermath of violence and fear. She lifted a finger and gently touched Xiaonu's tiny form. And even without words, he understood what she was trying to say. Thank you. The night that followed felt different from all the nights before. Jian built a fire and cleaned her wounds while Xiaonu kept watch from a high nearby branch. He could not protect her from giants with his size, but he could watch for approaching danger with his sharp Velith senses. And when she finally fell asleep from exhaustion, he stayed awake through the dark hours. He cleaned the blood from her cut with strips of cloth he tore from his own damaged clothing, checked her breathing and watched her temperature. Through the subtle changes in her skin color, he did everything she had done for him during his fever, returning care for care in the only way his small body allowed. When morning came and Jian woke, she found Xiaonu curled up against her neck. He had finally allowed exhaustion to claim him, and he slept with the trust of someone who knew they were protected. Jian smiled despite the pain in her face, and she let him rest while the forest woke around them. Later she would teach him the word for what they had become to each other, a word that transcended size and species. The word was family, and family, Xiaonu was beginning to learn, protected each other no matter the cost. Jian's dwelling stood in a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, and Xiaonu marveled at its strange construction as she carried him inside. The structure was larger than anything he had seen on his homeworld, built from materials he did not recognize and filled with objects whose purposes he could only guess. She set him down on a soft surface covered in fabric, and immediately began gathering items from around the room. Within an hour, she had created a small habitat just for him, lined with cotton and warmed by a device that glowed with gentle heat. Xiaonu watched her work with growing wonder, his fever making everything seem slightly unreal. This giant was building him a home within her home, a safe space designed specifically for his tiny body and his specific needs. When she finished, she stepped back and gestured toward her creation with an expression that seemed to ask for his approval. Xiaonu climbed into the soft nest she had made and felt tension leave his muscles for the first time in days. The warmth seeped into his bones, and the padding cushioned his injured wing, and he found himself making a sound of contentment that he had not expected. Jian's face transformed with that strange smile, and she moved away to give him space while he rested over the following days. Xiaonu's fever slowly broke as his body fought off the infection with help from the medicines Jian provided. She cleaned his wound with careful precision, using tools so large they could have crushed him, but which she wielded with remarkable delicacy. Her hands trembled slightly each time she touched him, as if she feared hurting him as much as he had once feared being hurt by her. Communication remained their greatest challenge, but they found ways to bridge the gap between their worlds. Jian drew pictures on paper, starting with simple images of herself and Xiaonu, and gradually building a vocabulary of shared symbols. He learned that she lived alone in this forest to study the creatures that inhabited it, watching and recording but never harming. The walls of her dwelling were covered with images of beings that flew and crawled and climbed, each one labeled with marks in her language. Xiaonu began to understand what Jin was even before he had words to describe it. She was not a hunter, but an observer. Not a predator, but a protector of the wild things that shared her world. When he pointed to himself and then to the images on her wall, she nodded eagerly and added his portrait to her collection. Seeing himself represented among the creatures she cherished made something warm bloom in his chest. One morning, Xiaonu woke to strange sounds coming from another room in the dwelling. He crept to the edge of his habitat and peered around the corner to see Jian bent over a container filled with soft materials. Inside the container lay a bird nearly as large as Xiaonu himself. its wing bound with white wrappings and its eyes closed in pain. Jian spoke softly to the creature as she worked, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she used when addressing Xianu. She fed the bird small pieces of food and dripped water into its beak, and she adjusted its wrappings with the same careful touch she had used on his own injuries. Xianu watched for hours as she cared for the wounded creature, and understanding crystallized in his mind with sudden clarity. This was what Jian did, and this was who Jian was. She found broken things and she fixed them, not for reward or recognition, but simply because fixing was in her nature. The Velith had no word for this kind of being, but Xianu thought that perhaps they should create one days turned into weeks. And Xianu's wings slowly healed under Jian's patient care. He began to flutter short distances across her dwelling, rebuilding strength in muscles that had atrophied during his recovery. Jian clapped her hands with delight each time he flew, and her joy seemed genuine rather than performed. She never tried to cage him or restrain him or keep him from moving freely through her space. Instead, she made accommodations for his presence, building small platforms where he could rest and creating pathways between rooms that he could navigate on foot when flying tired him. Xianu had never felt so respected by a being so much larger than himself. During his recovery, he began to study the remains of his ship, sorting through the wreckage that Jian had collected and brought back to her dwelling. His communication array had been destroyed beyond any hope of repair, but the core components might still function if he could find the right materials. He drew diagrams showing Jian what he needed, sketching crystals and metals in specific combinations that his technology required. She studied his drawings with intense concentration, and recognition eventually lit her features. Her gestures and expressions conveyed that she knew where to find these materials, and she offered to help him gather them. The day she healed the bird marked a turning point in Xianu's understanding of humanity. Jian carried the creature outside as Xianu watched from the window of her dwelling, holding it gently in her massive palms. She spoke words of farewell that the bird could not understand, and then she opened her hands and let it fly. The creature circled once above her head before disappearing into the forest, and Jian watched it go with tears streaming down her face. She did not try to keep it or mark it or take anything from it in exchange for the weeks of care she had provided. She simply let it go and wished it well. Xianu felt his entire conception of large beings crumble like the wreckage of his ship. His people had always assumed that size meant aggression, and that power meant dominion over smaller things. But Jian had power over everything in this forest, and she used that power to protect rather than to consume. She was what his language had no word for, what his culture had no framework to understand. She was a caretaker. When she returned inside and found Xianu waiting with his drawings of needed materials, she smiled through her remaining tears. Tomorrow they would venture into the forest together, and she would help him find what he needed to contact his people. But tonight she simply sat with him and taught him more words in her language, building bridges between their worlds one syllable at a time. Xianu practiced the sounds she made until his small voice could approximate their meaning. Please, and thank you. And friend Jian laughed with delight when he strung the words together, and he found himself laughing with her. This giantess had taken him from the edge of death and nursed him back to health, and she had asked nothing in return except his trust. Looking at her now, with evening light painting her face in golden shadows, Xianu knew that he had given her something more than trust. He had given her proof that small beings could overcome their fear of giants, and she had given him proof that giants could choose gentleness over violence in the quiet of her dwelling. Surrounded by images of creatures she had studied and saved, Xianu allowed himself to hope that rescue might not mean goodbye. Perhaps his people could learn what he had learned on this distant world. Perhaps fear was not the only possible relationship between the small and the large, and perhaps this giantess who had refused to eat him might instead become something far more valuable than a predator or threat. Perhaps she might become an ally. The morning arrived with pale light filtering through the canopy above, and Sianu woke to find something waiting outside his ruined ship. He pressed himself against the interior wall, his heart pounding as he peered through a crack in the twisted metal hull. The giantess had returned, but she had not approached his shelter during the night. Instead, she sat at the same distance as before, and arranged in front of her were objects that made no sense to his frightened mind. A tiny container held water that caught the morning light, like liquid crystal, and beside it lay fragments of something colorful that smelled sweet, even from this distance. A piece of soft material had been folded into a square no larger than his entire body. Sianu watched as the giantess pushed these items toward him using a long stick, moving them across the ground until they rested just a few meters from his hiding place. Then she withdrew the stick and settled back to wait, her massive form completely still except for the rise and fall of her breathing. The water called to him with an urgency that made his throat ache. He had not drunk anything since before the crash, and his body desperately needed hydration to begin healing his damaged wing. But accepting gifts from a predator seemed like the height of foolishness, and Sianu remained frozen in his shelter as minutes stretched into an hour. The giantess did not move. She did not try to lure him out with false promises or set traps around the offering she had left. She simply sat and waited with a patience that defied everything Sianu knew about large carnivorous species. Eventually, his thirst overcame his fear, and he crept out of the wreckage with his functional wings pressed flat against his back. Each step toward the water container felt like walking toward his own death. But the giantess remained perfectly still as he approached. He grabbed a tiny container and retreated immediately, splashing water on himself in his haste to drink. The liquid was cool and clean and tasted of nothing dangerous, and Sianu felt strength return to his limbs as he emptied the container. When he looked up, the giantess was smiling. The expression should have terrified him, as bared teeth meant aggression on most worlds. But something in her eyes suggested a different meaning entirely. She made soft sounds that vibrated through the air, and then she stood and walked away once again into the forest. Sianu stared after her until she disappeared, then turned his attention to the other offering she had left behind. The colorful fragments turned out to be some kind of fruit, sweet and filling and unlike anything he had tasted in his travels. The soft cloth provided warmth when he wrapped it around his shivering body. None of it made sense, but Sianu found himself hoping the giantess would return. The second day followed the same pattern as the first, with the giant appearing at dawn with new offerings and waiting at a distance while Sianu gathered them. She brought more water and more food, and she added a small container of something that smelled sharp and medicinal. Sianu recognized the gesture, even if he did not recognize the substance, and he began to wonder if this creature somehow knew he was injured. He applied the medicine to his torn wing with trembling hands, and the pain began to fade almost immediately. That night he slept better than before, though dreams of massive hands still haunted his rest. On the third day, the giantess brought paper covered in strange markings, and she pointed to herself while making a specific sound, Jian. She repeated the sound several times, touching her chest each time, and Sianu eventually understood that this was her name. He pointed to himself and spoke his own name, and her face lit up with that strange, non-threatening smile. Progress, however small, felt like victory in this impossible situation. But that evening, his wound betrayed him despite the medicine. Infection from the alien environment had taken hold, and Sianu felt heat spreading through his body as fever clouded his thoughts. He shivered uncontrollably in his shelter, too weak to eat the food Jian had left and too sick to fetch more water. World blurred around him as his bioluminescent skin flickered, with distress patterns that no one would understand. On this lonely world, he thought he was going to die. And the thought brought strange peace along with fear. At least the Giantess had not eaten him. And at least his final days had contained unexpected kindness from an unexpected source. Night fell with clouds rolling across the sky. And soon rain began to pound against the forest floor with tremendous force. Water leaked through the cracks in Siana's ship, soaking the cloth that had kept him warm and chilling his feverish body until his teeth chattered. He could not escape the water, and he could not stop shaking. And he closed his eyes to wait for the end. The sound of approaching footsteps barely registered through the haze of his illness. But when the rain suddenly stopped hitting him, Sianu forced his eyes open and saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Yi-Young knelt in the mud beside his ship, holding some kind of covering above him that shielded his shelter from the storm. Water poured down around them both, soaking her completely, but she kept her arms raised to protect him from the deluge. Lightning flashed across the sky, and in its brief light Sanu saw her face more clearly than ever before. There was no hunger in her expression, and no impatience at this uncomfortable task. There was only determination and something that looked remarkably like concern for his small, fragile life. She stayed through the entire night. When dawn finally broke and the storm faded, Sianu saw that Jian had not slept at all. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her body shook with cold. But she had not lowered her arms or abandoned her vigil. She had suffered through the night to keep him safe, and she had asked nothing in return. Something changed in Sianu at that moment, some fundamental understanding shifting in his fever-addled mind. Predators did not sacrifice comfort for prey, and monsters did not sit vigil through storms for creatures they intended to eat. The Velith had stories about giant devourers, but they had no stories about giant protectors. Perhaps that was because no Velith had ever stayed long enough to learn the truth. When Jian finally lowered her covering and extended her palm toward him, Xiandu did not scream. He did not try to flee or hide or pray for rescue from this gentle giant who had guarded him through darkness and rain. Instead, for the first time since crashing on this terrifying, beautiful world, Sianu made a choice based on trust rather than fear. He crawled forward on trembling limbs and climbed into the hand of the Giantess. Her fingers curled around him with impossible gentleness, and warmth seeped into his chilled body from her skin. She lifted him carefully and held him against her chest, where her heartbeat drummed a steady rhythm that somehow calmed his racing pulse. Jian spoke soft words he could not understand, but her tone conveyed meaning beyond language. She carried him away from the crash site, away from his ruined ship and broken equipment and shattered assumptions about the nature of large beings. As the forest passed by in a blur of green and brown, Sianu allowed himself to feel something he had not expected to feel on this alien world. Safe. The Giantess had found him broken and terrified, and instead of consuming him, she had chosen to care for him. He still did not fully understand why, but he was beginning to hope that he would live long enough to find out. The ship screamed as it tore through the atmosphere of the blue planet, and Sianu gripped his control panel with all four of his tiny hands while alarms blared warnings in his native tongue. He had trained for emergencies like this one, but training meant nothing when fire wrapped around his vessel and the ground rushed up to meet him faster than his mind could process. The Velith were not built for crashes, and their ships reflected this truth in their fragile construction and lightweight frames. Sianu was barely 20 centimeters tall, with translucent wings that folded against his back and skin that glowed soft blue when he felt strong emotions. Right now his entire body blazed with terrified light as he fought to slow his descent. The trees below grew larger and larger until he could see individual leaves And then the impact came with a sound like thunder. Metal crumpled around him as the emergency foam deployed, wrapping his small body in a protective cocoon that absorbed the worst of the collision. For a long moment, Keanu remained still, listening to the hiss of damaged systems and the strange sounds of an alien forest. When he finally cut himself free from the foam and crawled out of the wreckage, pain shot through his left wing, and he cried out in his high-pitched voice. The wing hung at a wrong angle, torn and useless, and Keanu knew he would not fly again until it healed. He stood in a crater of broken branches and scattered ship parts, surrounded by trees, taller than any structure on his homeworld. Everything here was massive beyond comprehension, and the weight of his situation pressed down on him like a physical force. His communication array had shattered in the crash, and his navigation equipment showed only static when he tried to activate it. He was alone on an uncharted world with no way to call for help and no way to know if rescue would ever come. The Velith had stories about worlds like this one, worlds where giant creatures roamed and small beings like themselves became nothing more than food. Keanu had always thought those stories were exaggerations meant to frighten young pilots into following proper survey protocols. Now he stood in the shadow of impossibly huge trees and wondered if every terrifying tale held truth at its core. He needed shelter before something found him. So he began to limp toward a fallen log that might provide cover. Each step sent pain through his injured wing, and his bioluminescent skin flickered with distress signals that no one was present to receive. The ground beneath his feet felt strange, covered in soft debris that cushioned his movements but also made walking difficult. He had traveled perhaps 10 meters when the earth began to shake. The vibration started subtle, like the rumble of distant machinery, but they grew stronger with each passing second until Keanu could barely keep his balance. Something massive was approaching through the forest, and each footfall sent tremors through the soil that nearly knocked him down. Keanu froze in place, his survival training warring with his panic as he tried to decide whether to run or hide before he could choose. The source of the tremors emerged from between two enormous trees, and Keanu felt his blood turn to ice. It was a giant, standing taller than his ship had been long, with 2 legs and 2 arms and a face that looked down at the crash site with obvious curiosity. The creature had dark hair that fell past its shoulders, and eyes that scanned the wreckage with what might have been concern or might have been hunger. Keanu had never seen a being so large, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee. The giant took another step forward, and the ground shook so hard that Keanu fell onto his back with a cry of pain. His wing twisted beneath him, and the agony made his vision blur with tears that glowed faintly in the forest shade when his sight cleared. The giant had crouched down and was staring directly at him with those enormous dark eyes. Keanu tried to scramble backward, but his injured wing caught on a twig and held him in place like a trap. The giant made a sound, a series of vibrations that might have been language but meant nothing to Keanu's translator implant. Then it reached toward him with a hand large enough to wrap around his entire body, and Keanu did the only thing he could think to do. He screamed. The sound that came from his throat was high and piercing, a Velith distress call that carried for kilometers on his homeworld. Here it seemed small and pathetic against the backdrop of the giant forest, but it made the creature pause with its hand still extended. Keanu kept screaming, his voice cracking as he pleaded in his own language for the giant not to eat him, not to crush him, not to end his life so far from everyone he loved. He thought of his family waiting for him to return from what should have been a simple survey mission. He thought of his friends who had celebrated his assignment to deep space exploration. He thought of all the things he had wanted to do with his life that would now never happen because he was about to become a meal for some primitive monster. The giant pulled its hand back. Xiaonu's screams faded into whimpers as he watched the massive creature slowly, carefully lower itself to sit on the ground several meters away from him. It did not advance, and it did not reach for him again. Instead, it simply sat there, watching him with an expression he could not read on its alien features. Minutes passed, and Xiaonu's terror began to mix with confusion as the giant made no move to attack. His heart still raced, and his skin still glowed with fear. But some small part of his mind started to question what was happening. Predators did not behave this way, and hunters did not give their prey time to recover. The giant reached into a pouch at its side, and Xiaonu tensed for whatever weapon might emerge. But the creature only pulled out a small container and what looked like a thin stick, and it began making marks on some kind of flat surface while occasionally glancing at him. Was it documenting him before the kill? Recording his species for some kind of collection? Xiaonu did not know, and the uncertainty terrified him almost as much as the certainty of death had moments before. The light began to fade as the sun moved across the sky, and eventually the giant stood up with movements that seemed deliberately slow. It looked at Xiaonu one more time, made more of those strange vibrating sounds, and then turned and walked away into the forest. Each footstep shook the ground less and less until finally the forest fell silent, except for the calls of small creatures in the trees. Xiaonu lay in the dirt beside his ruined ship, alone and injured, and more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. The giantess had found him helpless and had simply walked away. He did not understand why, and that lack of understanding frightened him more than teeth or claws ever could. As darkness crept through the forest, Xiaonu dragged himself into the shelter of his crumpled ship and wrapped his arms around his shaking body. Sleep would not come easily on this terrible world, but exhaustion eventually won its battle against fear. His last thought before unconsciousness claimed him was a question that would haunt his dreams throughout the long night ahead. What did the giant want from him, if not a meal?